You've probably heard of Steins Gate, one of the most famous and popular science fiction anime of recent time. However, what many people don't know is that Steins Gate is not an entirely standalone series. In fact, Steins Gate is only just the second part of a massive interconnected media series. The series is known as Science Adventure or Sci-ADV for short. Today I'll be guiding you on how to enter the greater Science Adventure series, what you need to know, and what to expect. Steins Gate, as well as Science Adventure, is actually a visual novel series at its core and not an anime series. Visual novels, for those of you unaware, are a type of video game in which the focus is the story over the gameplay. Science Adventure games in particular do not contain any notable gameplay. In addition to Steins Gate and Steins Gate Zero, Chaos Head, Robotics Notes, Chaos Child, and Occultic 9 all have anime adaptations. Now before I elaborate, I will say something rather extreme. If you refuse to play the visual novels, you shouldn't bother with this series. Outside of Steins Gate, these anime adaptations are mediocre at best and horrendous butcherings at worst. The worst offense of these adaptations is that their pacing is significantly faster than the story requires. As a result, the characters don't have time to properly leave impressions, plot points don't have time to be properly introduced and explored, and some vital story moments are completely skipped. But while pacing is by and far the most important issue when it comes to the anime adaptations, there is another problem, being the removal of connections between entries. If you're interested in the Sci-ADV universe because of its links to Steins Gate or how the overarching universe develops, the Sci-ADV anime will do nothing for you as a replacement for the visual novels. There are two entries in which watching the anime is encouraged in some part, being Occultic 9 and Steins Gate Zero. These reasons are rather circumstantial and will be explained later. So, Steins Gate is part of a series, but without any context from the other entries, Steins Gate seems standalone. So how exactly are they connected? A common assumption is that the stories aren't actually connected and that the only things linking them are the themes and style. This isn't actually the case. The stories are set in the same universe. This can be seen by mentions of Chaos Head events throughout Steins Gate, as well as mentions of Steins Gate in Robotics Notes. However, this isn't the full extent of the interconnectedness of the series. Story events from prior entries frequently end up influencing future ones, creating an interconnected universe where each entry can be affected by a previous one. When you look at every entry in the series as a single unit, you will see a single storyline that grows and develops throughout multiple entries, similar to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, I recommend shifting your mindset away from, this game is a Steins Gate prequel or sequel. This mindset often primes people to expect Steins Gate 2, which is not the intention of these stories. As such, it often damages people's opinions with the story when it tries to carve its own path. Instead, I recommend having the mindset of, this game is part of the Science Adventure series, which also includes Steins Gate. While each of these stories are written with their own individual plot lines and characters, I strongly recommend against jumping into later entries without experiencing the earlier ones. The people who recommend that you do so are often people who have skipped entries themselves. If you do so, it can feel like you've understood everything. This is because these stories are written in a way that assumes you have previous context, but it doesn't make it obvious if you're missing information. This missing context can come off instead as bad writing. For instance, experiencing Chaos Child without Chaos Head can result in mechanics appearing to be shoved in out of nowhere with very little setup or explanation. This is because the game assumes you have knowledge of Chaos Head and doesn't bother foreshadowing or properly explaining mechanics that have already been introduced and explored previously in the series. This scenario extends past Chaos Child and can occur in other later entries, such as Robotics Notes. Long story short, you should experience the series in release order to optimize your experience. Many fans, myself included, will tell you that just reading the entries in release order isn't enough to get the full science adventure experience. This is because the localization work for the series' English releases has been known to be rather shoddy. Many issues have been brought up regarding the localizations and issues such as mistranslations or mischaracterizations. However, the primary issue I'd like to address is inconsistent terminology. Many of the science adventure entries have been localized by completely different groups, many of which have little to no context to the other entries in the series. A term from one entry can be translated to something completely different in another entry. At its worst, it can completely kill the connections between entries, potentially resulting in story-breaking misunderstandings. As such, it is highly recommended to install the fan patch by the fan organization Committee of Zero in order to restore these connections and fix other localization or technical issues as well. However, please note that these patches are intended to work with the Steam versions of the games and may not be available on other platforms. From now on, I will be covering the entries individually. I will only be covering stories that have a significant impact on the overall science adventure storyline, meaning some spin-offs will be included, but others such as Steins Gate, Linear Bound and Phoenogram, and My Darling's Embrace will be omitted. To assist your adventure into the series, I will be providing an information template with 3 sections: Required, Recommended, and Guide. The required segment will consist of context that you need in order to fully understand the implications of the story. Without these, you may fail to understand the importance of vital scenes, and mechanics may appear to come out of nowhere without a proper introduction. The recommended section will consist of entries that will improve your experience through references and thematic connections, but are not strictly required to understand the story as it was meant to be told. The guide section will tell you if or when you need to use a guide in order to finish the game. Most of these entries require a guide at some point, as the route structure is not very intuitive and may result in the player getting stuck or playing the routes out of the intended order. With that, let's start with the first entry in the series. The very first entry for the Science Adventure series is Chaos Head, released in 2008. Set in 2008 Shibuya, Chaos Head tells the story of Nishijo Takumi, a high school recluse who finds himself unwillingly pulled into a series of horrific and bizarre serial killings dubbed the New Generation Madness. Chaos Head would undergo a re-release a year later called Chaos Head Noah. Noah is an overall improvement which adds characters to the story as well as other story adjustments. Chaos Head Noah is the only version that was released in English, being given a localization in 2022. Chaos Head Noah is the core of the Science Adventure series. In order to progress properly in this series, you need to understand this entry due to the extreme impact it has on the Science Adventure series. As such, you should read Chaos Head Noah as soon as you possibly can. Set in 2010 Akihabara, Steins Gate tells the story of Okabe Rintaro. Okabe is a college student who runs a makeshift laboratory with his friends. However, they find that one of their inventions has an unintended side effect of being able to transport text messages to the past with the ability to change the present. One thing to note about Steins Gate's visual novel is that Steins Gate's original visual novel is highly recommended over Steins Gate Elite. Elite replaces the sprites and artwork with clips from the anime, but it doesn't actually improve anything. In fact, it's commonly considered a downgrade due to cutting of some scenes and interactivity. Chaos Head Love Choo Choo is a sequel to Chaos Head Noah. After the events of Chaos Head Noah, Takumi finds himself in some kind of delusionary world in which the events of Chaos Head Noah have not played out like they have in reality. Instead of locking himself away, he becomes more proactive and engages in a romantic comedy-style story. As you can probably guess, Chaos Head Love Choo Choo serves as a less serious spin-off. Despite this, Love Choo Choo is fully canon and is referenced later, including a rather important plot point in regards to the status of the characters in later entries. As of now, it has not been released in English. However, the Committee of Zero is working on a translation. Robotics Notes is set in 2019 on the rural island of Tanegashima and follows a more lighthearted story. In Robotics Notes, high school student Kaito and his childhood friend Akiho are the last two students at their high school's robotics club. Throughout the story, Akiho faces numerous obstacles that obstruct the construction of the club's giant robot. Meanwhile, Kaito stumbles upon a series of documents that log plans for a world-threatening conspiracy. Unlike Steins Gate Elite, Robotics Notes Elite is an overall improvement, changing the story slightly to flow better and using anime footage sparingly. It is the only version available in English. Robotics Notes can be seen as a culmination of the Science Adventure series up until this point. Both Chaos Head and Steins Gate are very important in understanding the lore and events of the story. Chaos Child is a thematic sequel to Chaos Head, featuring an entirely new cast while exploring similar themes and mechanics. Set in 2015 Shibuya, high schooler Miyashiro Takaru, orphaned after the events of Chaos Head, is an arrogant student who heads his school's newspaper club. One day, Takaru discovers that a new set of serial killings is occurring on the same dates as the New Generation killings from Chaos Head. Being an avid follower of the original New Generation killings, Takaru seeks to report on this case and solve it before the police can. However, he soon begins to notice that the case is much more dangerous than he expected. While Chaos Child is a thematic sequel, it is heavily intertwined with the events of Chaos Head, so to treat it more like a direct sequel despite the new cast. Steins Gate Zero features the return of Okabe and the rest of the Steins Gate cast. Steins Gate Zero is set in a future in which Okabe failed to achieve the ending we see in the original Steins Gate. Despite efforts from the rest of the cast to get Okabe to try again, he refuses. However, Okabe's refusal to try again has set the timeline on a new course, in which much more violent events await in the near future. Reminders of past events cause Okabe to struggle with depression, while the preparations for disaster become all too apparent. One thing to note about Steins Gate Zero: its anime adaptation is not a full adaptation. It is instead a complement to the visual novel. The Steins Gate Zero anime shows the story that leads up to the true ending of the Steins Gate Zero visual novel. The full story can be experienced by reading the visual novel and then watching the anime. Much like Chaos Head Love Choo-Choo, Chaos Child Love Choo-Choo takes place in a delusionary world in which the serial killings never occurred. Without any cases to obsess over, Takaru engages in a romantic comedy-style story with the other cast members. Like Chaos Head Love Choo-Choo, Chaos Child Love Choo-Choo is also fully canon and referenced in future entries. The Committee of Zero is working on a translation as well. In Occultic 9, high schooler Gamma Yuta commentates on entries on the occult on his online blog. However, he and 8 other people appear to get caught up in some seemingly supernatural event. Occultic 9 is in an interesting spot here. Its source material actually comes from a light novel series. The light novel series was never finished. They were adapted into a visual novel, but the visual novel is not translated. As such, it is recommended to watch the anime to get some semblance of a full story. Alternatively, you can read the light novels and then watch the anime's ending. Robotics Notes Dash is set 6 months after the events of Robotics Notes. At this time, the island is throwing the Tanegashima Gun Festival and celebrating the events of Robotics Notes. Meanwhile, Daru from Steins Gate arrives on the island to carry out some kind of secret mission as the festival gets thrown into havoc. Despite the way it's presented and marketed, Robotics Notes Dash is not actually a serious sequel. It's more similar to the sequels of the Love Choo-Choo games, being less serious and containing lots of fan service. However, Robotix Notes Dash has events that appear to have large ramifications for the future of the series. Anonymous Code is the most recent release of the Science Adventure series. Set in the future of 2037, Takaoka Palan is a rookie hacker who works with his hacking team to help people in need. However, his life gets flipped around after a strange girl pulls him into life-or-death hacking missions from the mysterious Cicada 3301, revealing secrets that could threaten the existence of the world. The story and reveals within Anonymous Code recontextualize events in nearly every previous entry, and has been foreshadowed as far back as in Chaos Head Noah. Disregarding the entries that I marked as required, it is recommended to go into Anonymous Code with as much exposure with the series as possible. Anonymous Code is the most recent entry to be released, but it is not necessarily the finale of the series. Mages, the company that produces the series, has announced a future Steins Gate thematic sequel. It is planned to follow in the footsteps of Chaos Child, in that it will focus on a new cast and have its own story that builds off the events of the original Steins Gate without directly continuing it. There is still more content in the Science Adventure universe to explore in the form of side mangas, side novels, and other visual novels. Down in the description is a list of supplemental content that is available for the series. This supplemental content is not necessarily required to enjoy the series, but it helps flesh out the world and characters, including story epilogues, character backstories, and more. That wraps up my introduction to the series. Thanks for watching!